Hey guys, it's Evan from Interrobang Tarot, looking very Mr. Rogersy today. You might hear laundry in the background. I'm multitasking. I had set up this YouTube a while back just to post some deck walkthrough videos when I was kickstarting the tarot decks, and I thought it would be fun to use the space to set it to work. Alright, so there's a lot of topics that we could potentially talk about, but I did put out a call for AMAs on my Discord community, and people sent in some questions, so I thought we'd start with those, and then I'll launch into further topics from there. And if you have a question that you'd like to know about tarot or about any of the creative process crafts that I do, you can submit that in the comments or come join the Discord community or the Patreon community. Shout out your questions. And if there's juicy ones that come up, I might make a video when I have time to do that. So I thought we'd start off with the questions about tarot spreads, since spreadcraft is a big part of what I do on the Interrobang Tarot blog. It's really only the tip of the iceberg in terms of what I do as an artist, but it is how a fair number of people find my work. So the spreads have some of the spreads have circulated quite a bit. So you might be here because you've seen like the what the fuck tarot spread going around or something like that. So yeah, one of our Discorders asked, what do you do when a spread really throws you a wild card? So like everything else in the spread makes sense and is fitting together smoothly, and then something seems really out of context or coming out of left field. How do you figure out how that all fits together? That's a great question. So one way to tackle this is actually preventative. And one thing that I like to do when I have a lot going on in my life, like multiple issues active at a given time, or when I'm writing a spread for a topic that I know is likely to have like either a lot of complex factors or a sort of general reading vibe, maybe a Celtic cross stand-in, anything that could potentially tag in more than one major life issue at once or be open to a lot of chaos in the process. I'll actually write in or add in a wild card position in the spread that acts as a kind of container for those out of left field messages. Just throw something else down on the table as you're shuffling and drawing your cards. Make a plan that you're going to have one extra card there for what else do I need to know that I'm not considering, or a wild card, something random and chaotic coming out of left field. So that can actually do a fair bit of preventative work for having those out of context, really confusing cards show up in your reading, because there's a place for those more chaotic messages to go. Another thing to pay attention to is jumper cards. So when you're shuffling your cards and a bunch fall out of the deck, or maybe not a bunch, maybe it's just one card falls out on the floor while you're shuffling. Sometimes it's a little handful. You can pay attention to those and read those as wild cards. Maybe they're off topic for the spread that you're drawing, but it speaks to something else that you really need on your radar. A lot of readers do read significance into jumper cards and pay extra attention to them because it's like leaping out to get your attention kind of thing. One general approach to tarot reading is to code whatever happens within the reading as having divinatory significance. So that's an area where we see that. Now, if you haven't made space for a wild card, or maybe if you have, like maybe you have jumpers and wild cards and still you're reading, parts of it aren't making sense, parts of it aren't cohering. Usually for me, that just takes a little bit more time or an additional sense of perspective. So this is going to seem a little bit tangential for a sec, but bear with me. So if you've ever read Philip Pullman's Golden Compass books, which are wonderful books, highly recommend. They're kind of kids YA, but there's a lot in there for for grown-ups. And the main character in that series is a young girl who receives this divinatory tool that's very complex. It has a kind of compass clockwork face to it, layout. It's called the alethiometer or alethiometer. I'm not sure how you say that. Alethiometer or alethiometer. Yeah, I don't know how it's supposed to be pronounced in American. But anyway, this fictional divination device that she uses has little wheels that turn, and it points to picture symbols, and they light up, and it can go around multiple times or pass over the same symbol multiple times. And those numbers of where it pauses or where it circles around before it hits on the thing again are significant and point to different layers of meaning within the symbolism. And this character is able to read it intuitively and naturally. She has a gift for it, where usually people have to study this device for, many, many years to be able to make sense of it. And I think that's a wonderful analogy for how divination can actually work in practice for people who do believe in it and practice it, as whether or not you're approaching it psychically, like whether or not you believe that there's anything mystical or psychic or woo-woo to it. A lot of people just use it as a tool for introspection or a psychological prompt, and that's okay too. But either way, any of the symbols within tarot can mean multiple things, and there are many layers of meaning to any given card. So a lot of times when we're working with spreads, we're looking at the overall context to tell us a story about what those cards say together and in relation to one another, because any one of those cards can bring up so many layers of meaning. It actually helps to have more cards on the table and a story in the picture that they tell together to narrow those meanings down, those potentials down. So a lot of times, if something is confusing, it helps to go back and review the other cards on the table and try to zoom out and get the bigger picture sense of, like, what's the story here, and how would the other cards on the table change the story of the confusing card. So that's a good place to start. Just kind of cycle through those layers of meaning and be like, okay, which is actually relevant to the picture of the other stuff on the table, and does that clarify anything? Another thing that you can do that I often like to do, even if you have the cards memorized, like say you've been reading for a long time, that doesn't mean that you can't use outside texts. And sometimes tarot will tag in another author's words as a kind of bibliomancy. Like tarot can be just focused on the pictures on the table and your own thoughts and intuitions and feelings about them, but the text from the books, that especially if the author illustrator of the deck that I'm working with has a guidebook or has supplementary text that they've offered, I love to go and look, like, okay, what did this mean to the person that designed that card? Do they have more information there? Because sometimes the message on the table isn't necessarily the catalog of meanings that I have memorized. In my mind, it's something that's phrased specifically in the author artist's words. So I do like to do that. One of my favorite decks is the Slow Hauler Collective deck, and they have a wonderful little guidebook. It's like a little chunky little flip book, but it's great. It's got wonderful words of wisdom, different perspective than I have on a lot of the cards. So if I'm reading with that deck, a lot of times I'll generate my own interpretations first, and then I'll go back and I'll read everything from the book and see what they have to say. And a lot of times there's a little keyword or key phrase that kind of jumps out that kicks you in the pants a little bit. And that's really and ends up being what that card is about. It's not just the picture on the card, it's a tag to the words that came with the deck, because there's a message there from that author or that artist that is actually what I need to hear in the moment. So that can be a layer to clarify those things. Don't feel like you can't consult guidebooks and consult texts because you have to have everything memorized. It can really be both, and the bibliomancy part of it is, I think, part of tarotcraft. So I would say those first two layers, like those first two passes of big picture, zoom out, other cards on the table story, and then consulting the guide text from whoever the author illustrator was. If there is no guide text from the author illustrator, I'll go look and see what Rachel Pollack had to say. She's always my backup. Not even backup. She's my, 78 Degrees of Wisdom is one of my most formative and beloved tarot influences. If there's no book or text that comes with the deck that I'm working with, then 78 Degrees of Wisdom is the text that I use for an outside voice. So I would say those two passes probably cover 99% of material that's unclear to me within a reading. If something is still unclear after that, you can draw a follow-up card for that placement, and I would try to keep it just to one follow-up. If you end up drawing multiple follow-ups, at that point you're spinning your wheels and just confusing yourself more. That's more information that you need, but sometimes you just need an extra card to be like, okay, what exactly do you mean here? And then the intersection of what those two cards say together generates your reading and should help clarify things. So that can be helpful. I might kick it to poetic logic if something is still unclear. There's a great spreads directory on interrobangtarot.com that has all the spreads in the collection that I've designed so far, organized and linked to where you can find them, and they're separated out by topic. So there's a subset, like a branch of spreads that I like to write that I call Focus Esoterica, and we'll do a separate video about what that phrase means in more depth. But within Spreads land, when I've filed something as Focus Esoterica, it's usually a little bit more poetic and abstract and opaque in the way the spread placements are described. And so I used poetically stated and written prompts to generate more poetic and lyrical answers. And you can do this with other spreads too. It doesn't have to be the more poetic, deeper, weirder spreads. A lot of those are shared with the muses on Patreon, so it's one of the higher priced tiers. We have those at a higher tier on Patreon because the symbolic posts, a lot of times they jump off the other projects that I'm doing, so the process posts on the other artwork, it does a lot to contextualize them. And sometimes they get into like weirder and darker material than or more personal stuff than I would necessarily want to share on the broad open entire internet sparkles. So it's one mode and style of reading that I like to play with. It's definitely not how I approach all my readings, and I probably wouldn't try to read for this. I probably wouldn't try to read this way for somebody else. I think it's more useful and sensible in a private practice when you're reading for yourself. But it's to ask the cards to prompt like a really brief, just quick but poetic and lyrical, maybe a little bit abstract or dream logic-y one-liner. So yeah, try to come up with like a poetic one-liner that would go with or answer that card, and then sometimes taking things more into dream logic, more into subconscious logic, more into poetic and lyrical space actually ends up netting more juice and making more sense, even if it comes through the vehicle of nonsense. I feel like this is not going to make sense without an example. Let me hang on. So you know that thing in Greek mythology with Cassandra where, and other oracles too, Delphic oracles, where an oracle or a diviner would come up with a message that's technically true and accurate, but like makes no sense from an outside perspective. This idea that true prophecy, true premonition often comes in a form that is floral or opaque or dreamy and confusing, could be interpreted in a couple different ways. And so it's really beautiful in terms of literature. It's beautiful irony in the storytelling that you have these true prophecies that nobody can understand and everybody interprets the wrong way until they come to pass, and then it finally clicks at the end after the thing already happens. So this style of reading is kind of like trying to hack that. Not exactly in reverse. It's like trying to go there on purpose. It's like asking yourself to generate something that comes out in garbled prophecy babble. But in a way that actually generates a lot more material to chew on, and something that hits closer to home than trying to be too straightforward and too practical in your reading. So sometimes you just have to get a little bit spacey and lyrical with it. All right, so I got my spreads books. These are my spreads. So many of the spreads. I don't know why I call them sprads in my brain. They are spreads, but I like to think of them as sprads. Makes them sound like chads or brads. I don't know why that's amusing to me, but it is. So anyway, these are my sprads. There's a fucking ton of them. Binder 1. Binder 2. Where did I put the focus of Esoterica bullshit? Alright, so this was one of the Patreon spreads, and I'm not going to reveal the whole thing because that would be rude to the subscribers. But we'll pull a random placement. Why don't we just do those 3? I'll do, so 8, 9, and 10. Cup and Saucer, Crow's Feet, and Witch's Broom. And we'll do this as a collective draw for the Hive, things that the Hive could stand to hear. So we're reading with the Black Ink Tarot deck, which is one of my tarot decks that just came out. Very pretty. Let me shuffle these up. And I'll show you what I mean by asking your readings and spreads to be poetic and lyrical and obtuse at you on purpose. And how that can help. It's like it generates a little meditation prompt that can run off in different directions if you sit with it. A lot of this all comes down to time too. Like a lot of times you just need to sit with it. Sometimes things clarify the next day or the next week. Sometimes you really don't have the pieces of the puzzle put together to understand what you're getting, and then you get more layers of meaning out of it in a couple days or in a week or so. You go, oh, that's what that's about. So that can happen. Okay, so we've got 3 weirdly written prompts. We've got 3 random cards drawn. And the trick in this game is to distill the reading into a one-liner. So, and that it doesn't have to necessarily make like really clear sense. It could be poetic and lyrical. It could be off the wall. All right, Cup and Saucer. 1 small sustaining pleasantry, a token of fortune. We got the Queen or the Beaver of Gems, which is also corresponded with Capricorn. That would be the Queen of Pentacles in a traditional tarot deck. So I'm going to say for that one, you can have what you make. Crow's Feet. The prompt says, sky things scratching awkward at the ground. And for that, we drew Libra. And that's the Swan of Arrows or the Queen of Swords in a traditional deck. And so in response to the prompt, sky things scratching awkward at the ground, drawing the Swan, I'm going to say that the most elegant bird is least graceful when grounded. And then for the next card, Witch's Broom, ground things raised defiantly to sky. We drew the 6 of matchsticks or the 6 of wands reversed. And so for that, I'm going to say we don't need to get where we're going. And then, so our whole reading together, 1, 2, 3, becomes... You can have what you make. The most elegant bird is least graceful and grounded, and we don't need to get where we're going. So that gives us something evocative. It gives us seeds for other thoughts, things we could grow other thoughts on, and something to just kind of chew on and feed back to the subconscious and give it a minute. And then come back in another day or two and see what else that brings up. Which is not always satisfying in the moment, right? So, a lot of times when we're drawing tarot or we're doing any kind of divination stuff, it's because we're chewing on problems that we want to answer now. And part of the game and part of the practice when we get stuck is to give it a little bit more time and have some patience when things don't those answers that we're seeking don't necessarily come together on the time frame that we want. You might want an immediate solution or immediate fix or immediate clarity to something that's very complex, or has a lot of moving parts that haven't settled yet, or that has a lot of open trajectories that are still on the table for you. And maybe there's not just one easy answer. It might be that part of the reason that something is coming out of left field and being confusing within your spread and within your reading is because there's another moving part to your situation that's influencing the bigger picture. And what you're asking about, what you're working with, what you're dealing with in your life isn't neat and tidy. It might not cohere into a satisfying narrative on the table because you're not dealing with a satisfying narrative or a clear solution in your life. So that can be part of the picture too. Just a little bit of leaving space for that, and leaving space for yourself to sit with things and come back with another pass another day. Not necessarily even redrawing, like you can come back and review your it's very helpful to journal and then review your readings and see, like, oh, that meant one thing on Thursday and it means something else on Saturday. That happens a lot. A lot of times those things that don't make clear sense right away just need a little bit of time to go here, and may even be skewing a bit predictive. So I do believe that premonition and predictive readings are possible. You don't have to approach tarot that way. That's not how you have to work. But for some people, your practice might end up skewing that way. And that can be tricky because in part we want our divination tools to be able to tell us things that we don't know yet. But necessarily, it makes it a lot harder to interpret what we're getting if we don't have all the information in our immediate lives. So, you can ask the cards, tell me something I don't know, and they can tell you something that you don't know, and that doesn't mean that you're going to understand it when they do. And more of that comes with time and with practice. Things will become clearer faster the more often you practice, and the more layers and catalogs of meaning you build up, the better you get to know your cards and how they speak to you. I brought in another light. The shadows from the default lighting in this room get really harsh. So my camera cut off there. Let me try to remember what I was saying. So just to sum up with where we left off on that question of what to do when one card in a spread doesn't make any sense. The first step would be to zoom back out, look at the broader context of the reading, think in terms of story between the cards and how the different cards can influence each other, and then cycle through your catalog of what that card can potentially mean and look for what's going to make the most sense in the context of the story, understanding that something might not make a great deal of sense in the context of the story because there could actually be multiple things going on and complex factors in your life that could cause those kinds of wild card phenomena to crop up. And again, you can be preventative with that by leaving space in your readings for a wild card position to vent and channel some of that off the wall, less sense-making energy, the more surprise messages that you might get within a reading. And then next pass would be to look back at text, either from the book that comes with the deck that you're reading, whatever the author and illustrator had to say, or what one of your favorite tarot authors has to say about that, and see if a layer of bibliomancy leaning on the text that accompanies the deck pulls things into clarity. And then another trick is to pass it off to lyrical or poetic space and try to distill it into a one-liner, even if it makes a little bit less sense in a direct and concrete way. Give yourself something poetic or vague or abstract to chew on. And then the biggest thing And then really the biggest thing is just to give things time and to come back and look at it with fresh eyes another day and see if it clarifies as you get more information about your situation in your actual daily life. So as somebody who's been reading for a long time, when I was starting out, I had a much higher percentage of those cards that really didn't make sense within readings. And which is natural, of course, when you are are new to tarot, and the person who asked this might not be particularly new to tarot. I don't know how long they've been practicing, but I'm going to assume that some of the people watching this video are new to tarot. So just understand that it's normal when you're starting out to have more of those experiences of like, well, this doesn't make any sense. The more experience you get and the better you get at really finding multiple layers of meaning and interpretations and possibilities within each card, that's going to reduce. And I would say now, over 20 years in, it is fairly common for me to draw a spread with at least one card that's kind of like, oh, I'm not sure what that's about at first glance. But it's very rare for me to draw a spread where any of the cards don't make sense after sitting with it for like half an hour to an hour. This is going to sound salty, but I'm speaking to my own foibles here, so, because I do this too. Expecting things to make sense and jump into clarity in the first 10 minutes of looking at your reading is not necessarily a realistic goal. So a lot of times when something is confusing, I have to ask myself, like, okay, have I thought about it? How long have I thought about it for? And it's pretty rare for a card not to make sense in the context of a reading after I've actually sat and chewed on it for, half an hour to an hour, put some effort into it, or circled back to it the next day. So time is annoying, but it is very helpful and beneficial. A lot of times something that looks like it doesn't make sense at first glance, that's actually where a lot of the nuance and intrigue can end up falling in a reading. Pay attention to stuff that seems to contradict itself within your readings, cards that are either very similar in contrary positions, or cards that seem to be clashing with each other, especially when you get that in a dynamic of a reading where, like, the positions of the reading seem confusing or ironic or weird with the cards that are falling in them. You might get a double negative, or say you have two cards that are fairly similar and one is in a position of something to let go of and move away from, and the other very similar card is showing up in a position of something to move toward and move ahead with. So a lot of times that's an invitation to get really nuanced and clear, and to dial down on the more subtle differences between those cards. So if you have something that looks contradictory at first glance, it might actually just be pointing to something that's more fine-tuned or nuanced or particular. For an offhand example, say I take the Three of Pentacles and the Eight of Pentacles, so two cards that are both about craft. And I have one saying, don't do this, and the other saying, yes, do this. So the answer to me for figuring out that reading is actually to dial way closer in on the slight differences between those cards. And that's not necessarily contradicting itself. It's telling me that there's a subtle difference that I need to pay attention to, and that's where I'm going to find my direction. So, the three of gems is very collaborative. The Eight of Gems or Pentacles is more about the solo crafter working alone in their studio. So it might be telling me that, like, yes, I've got a lot of creative work to do, but I need to take it into solo studio time and watch out for design by committee problems, something like that. So it's not, when you get a potential conflict or a potential contradiction, it's not always the cards aren't making sense or the cards are contradicting each other. It's often pointing to a very subtle, specific distinction that when you figure out what it is, there's actually a lot of information and benefit, but it's just going to be more narrow, more focused, more pinpointed, and more subtle. So I'm chipping away at these Discord AMAs for tarot videos, And another question on spreads I got asked: when you're making a spread, do you start with shape or ... question mark? So do you start with shape? Do you start with something else? So that really depends on the topic at hand. Spreadcraft is great fun, and it can be just as complicated and artsy-fartsy as you want to make it. I really strongly believe that crafting a good tarot spread can take as much creativity and interest in artistry again as you want to pour into it, and it can occupy just as much as a card itself or a description in a book. It really is a valid craft of its own, and almost anything that can inspire a question can inspire a good tarot spread. So the possibilities really are endless, and my spreads are based on a number of different things. Sometimes I do start with a shape. Sometimes I have, it really depends on the situation at hand, and it depends on what I want the reading to be for too. So whether I'm drawing tarot as a creative prompt, as an editing guide, as an introspection thing that I want to take into journaling and sorting out my feelings, or as a divination tool or a ritual kind of thing, whether it's part of a more magical or esoteric practice, or whether it's a practical issue that I'm trying to figure out, or a creative prompt, is really gonna shape and guide what form the spread takes. And sometimes I don't have any of those things in mind, and I just want to build a spread around something that I find funny or interesting or inspiring, where I think like, oh, that's a cool symbol, let's make a spread out of it. So sometimes it's just very playful, and the spreads crop up around different ideas that I'll encounter in the wild, and it's not necessarily coming out of need. It can also come out of just a sense of play. So sometimes I start with shapes, sometimes I start with quotes or scraps of text or phrases or words. Sometimes I start with pictures or symbolic images and symbols. So what prompts the spread varies widely, and then how I'm going to organize the spreads in the layout on the table also varies depending on the topic and the ritual at hand. So sometimes they do have a geometric layout, sometimes the layout is pictorial, and sometimes it has some kind of a ritual function of cards going in a certain order or following a certain shape, but sometimes it's just laid out linearly. Whatever makes sense for the topic at hand and the way that I want to use that reading. Any of my spreads that you're working with, they can be adapted to your own needs and your own preferences. So a lot of the spreads that I write do have kind of like pictorial, the card positions can be all over the table depending on the shape that I might be drawing with them. Like sometimes there's a horizon line and you've got above ground and underground cards, and so the numbers can be all over the place. But any of those can just be laid out in a grid or in a row if you are more of a linear thinker than a pictorial thinker, and if that's easier for you, you can adapt them and read them whatever way is going to work best for you, and practice is fine. So yeah, spreadcraft is a whole thing, and I've given a talk about this before at the Witch City Tarot Gathering. I have slides already outlined. That's something that I could throw together a class on, if that's something that you guys would be interested in, like a correspondence course, get a video and downloads and a chance to ask questions. So if that's something that you guys would enjoy, let me know. I could throw that together. I have not taken the time yet, but that is something we could do if you'd like. All right, so that is plenty to chew on for spreads. Thanks for the great questions, guys. Thanks for watching if you got through all this. And I'll link you the spreads directory to interrobangtarot.com below, and there's also some more juicy spreads and some notes about working with spreads in the Fortunes Inkwell guidebook. And this does accompany my decks, but you don't need my decks to work with this book. It is a standalone chunky occult text that can work with any deck in your system. So happy reading, happy card slaying, and I will catch you in the next video.